Good evening. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. My name is TravisShaddox. Turfgrass Epistemology is the study of turfgrass knowledge. How do we know what we know about turfgrass science? We're going to explore some of the scientific literature on this episode today. But why does this episode exist? Or why does the channel exist? Well, part of why the channel exists is because of the tree octopus. What is that? I'm sure people who are, let's see, I guess you'd have to be 20, almost, well, yeah, you have to be at least probably 30, 35 years old to have actually been around when the tree octopus was around, or know about it. But anyway, the tree octopus is was a website. In fact, let me get this up. I'll pull it up. I'll show you what it is. So the tree octopus is a website. It's called the Pacific Northwest Tree Octopus. Help save the endangered Pacific Northwest tree octopus from extinction. It's a real website. And how on earth did I get on tree octopus on the Turfgrass Epistemology channel? But I did today somehow. That's where I get in the craziest things sometimes. But this is a tree octopus, and you can read all about it. And the Pacific Northwest tree octopus can be found in the temperate rainforest of the Olympic Peninsula of the west coast of North America, and all kinds of stuff. He goes through here and talks about the endangeredness, shows maps of the locations, and really discusses the tree octopus have eyesight comparable to humans. Besides allowing them to see their prey and environment, it helps them in inter-octopus relationships, and really goes through the whole thing. And it explains why it's endangered. All the tree octopus is not officially, although it's not officially listed as on the endangered species list, we feel that it should be added since its numbers are at a critically low level. And it really goes through all the stuff and explains in great detail what it is and why it's endangered and how you can help and activism. You can see all the stuff if you're watching on the channel. If you're listening, you can go to, it's zapatopi.net and then /tree octopus, ZAPATOPI.net, tree octopus. So you can read all about it, and it's complete BS. It was intentionally created by I don't know who did it. I don't know if it is even on here, but he did it with the intent. He created this with the intent of showing people that not everything on the internet is real. Most of what's on the internet is complete nonsense and BS. And that's partly why this channel exists, is because although the tree octopus is a hoax, I mean, it's known now to be a hoax. It was created with the intent of fooling people, like a magician. A magician, they're going to fool you. You're paying to be entertained, for them to fool you, This website was created with the intent of showing the gullibility of the average school student or whatever that might be. But they tell you it's fake. But in the world of turfgrass science, they don't come out and tell you that it's all nonsense and BS. There's a lot of good information. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of really good information, a lot of sound resources and sound evidence and sound best management practices generated, and it's on the internet. But there's a whole big steaming pile of BS out there as well. And that's why this channel exists to some degree, is to help the turfgrass industry prioritize information. How do we prioritize the information that we receive? And I didn't see a whole lot of people discussing the scientific literature and going through it and really trying to educate the public on how it is we come up with best management practices, why certain management practices exist, and why scientists have the position they have. I didn't see many people doing that. And so this channel exists to go over that information and to discuss it and to, expose a wider audience to that, to the literature. So anyway, God knows how the heck did I get on that? Sorry. Welcome Scott Lindgren to the pro level membership. I appreciate it. Joe Calla, Gray Fox, Chuck, Eric, Jeremy, Rob, a lot of people in the chat tonight. I'll get started. We're going to be fairly quick on this one. We've been going over the base count and saturation idea, philosophy, which is the hoax and the bogus, fraudulent, scam, whatever other term you want to come up with, philosophy of how to interpret soil test and soil test values. and it's used by a large number of farmers in the agriculture community, and it's used, unfortunately, by a large number of turfgrass managers as well. Not necessarily, I don't really know how each one of them got on that particular boat, but it's promoted by salesmen and promoted by some companies and some soil test laboratories as a means to manage your nutrients. We've been going over paper after paper after paper explaining why it is, or what it is, and then why it is not useful in terms of an efficient use of your resources and efficient use of your money to result in some acceptable turfgrass. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to go over one more really important paper, and then next week, I haven't decided what the papers will be next week. It'll be base count saturation. I haven't decided if I'm going to go back to turf or I'm going to stay in the farming literature, the agriculture literature. But we're going to go over another. This is the sister paper of the paper we went over on Monday morning on the Members Only show. That reminds me, the Members Only, if you're going to do a Calendly appointment with me, that's how I provide online consultation services to Turfgrass, the Turfgrass industry. If you're going to do that, you might as well just be a pro member of the YouTube channel, because you'll get the Calendly consultation once a year for free, and it'll pay. It's the same. You'd be paying for it with the YouTube membership, and you'd be getting all the extra videos I do on Monday morning for the members, and we do a 2 to 3 month rolling meeting with the pro members only, and there's all sorts of other things you get as a pro member. So you might as well just be a pro member if you're going to do a Calendly appointment with me. And if you don't want to do that, fine. But the Calendly appointment is basically free if you're a pro member. On September 18th, if anybody is in the Northwest Panhandle of Florida and wants to come say hello to me, I'll be at the University of Florida J Field Day. If anybody's ever been in that area, it is in the middle of Farm Central. And Dr. Unruh has had a program there for almost 30 years now. The very first turf field day I ever spoke at was in J 25 years ago. And so I'll be there again in September, on September 18th, and I'll give I guess I'm giving 2 or 3 talks there. And it'll be my 25-year anniversary of talking at field days. So I can't even believe I'm saying that, but I don't know how that's possible 25 years ago. But Dr. Unruh pulled up a photograph. I didn't even know it existed of me speaking at that field day. And I was like, holy cow. I was still really wet behind the ears. I didn't even know that photo existed. So I'll be there. Okay, now on to the paper. Today's paper is entitled The Basic Cation Saturation Ratios as a Basis for Fertilizing and Liming Agronomic Crops. This is part 2, the field studies. Okay. The part 1, which was the incubation study, we went on Monday morning. If you want to see that here or watch that episode, you'll have to be a member, because it's behind the members, the membership wall. You can listen to it on podcast though. If you are a podcast listener, I load all the episodes so everybody can listen to them on the podcasts. This was by McLean, Hartwig, Eckert, and Triplett in 1983. This was published in Agronomy Journal. Agronomy Journal is the flagship journal of the Agronomy Science Society of America, and I encourage those to at least explore the literature. You can go and read the abstracts and read all the titles of all the articles going back 100 years in some cases. You can at least read the abstract and the title and get an idea of what exists. You can't read all the articles unless they're open access, but you can always become a member and you can read all the articles that way. Okay? Okay, so base count and saturation. In building up the fertility and lime levels of agricultural soils from soil test results, one or the other of 2 concepts is usually relied upon as a basis for making recommendations of the amounts of amendments to apply. These 2 concepts are the sufficiency level and base cation saturation ratio. The sufficiency level concept grew out of Bray's development of soil tests and applications of soil test values to the Mitscherlich's concept, and decreased growth response with increased levels of an available nutrient until a maximum yield is attained at a so-called sufficiency level of nutrient. I apologize to my German listeners. The early scientific literature in soil tests, there's a lot of German authors before World War II, even before World War I. There was a lot of German scientists that did a lot of work, and so I'm butchering Mitscherlich. I always pronounce it Mitscherlich, but he did a lot of equations on sorption and desorption of nutrients in soils. And he has an equation named after him. I think it's the Mitscherlich equation, the Mitscherlich concept. I can't remember. But anyway, He's talking about basically to reach maximum yield, there's a certain amount of nutrient that would need to achieve that, and that's called the sufficiency level. The SLAN concept may be applied to all plant essential elements. The base count saturation concept came from the work of Baer and coworkers, which we have not yet gone over. Baer's 45 paper. That's the one that started this whole nonsense off, this paper right here, and we'll go over that for sure. It might be next Monday. I don't know. And then Baer and Toth in 48, and it progressed from there. It deals with the nutrients which exist as basic cations, particularly calcium, magnesium, potassium. Its validity rests on the assumption that there is an optimum saturation of the soil cation exchange capacity for each basic cation, and thus there are ideal ratios of these basic cations at which maximum yield occurs. However, from the beginning, Dr. Baer and coworkers reported near maximum yields of alfalfa through a range of calcium to potassium ratios from 100 to 1 to 1 to 1. And this Hunter paper is the Hunter Baer paper of 1943. So in other words, from the very beginning of this whole nonsense, the people that said you should have the ratios like this, their own data, which I've said for many episodes now, their own data refuted it. It boggles my mind how this stuff gets into scientific literature, which is one reason why I'm so stern on some other nonsense and some other management practices that might quote unquote work, because they might work, but in order for them to be included in the scientific model, they must go through the scientific vetting process. It's just that simple. And because even this did go through the scientific vetting process and it still got in, the nonsense still got in. So it just boggles my mind how that happens, but it did in that case. Furthermore, the allowable ranges in calcium, magnesium, and potassium saturations proposed by Graham. Remember, Graham was the one who took Baer's range values, and then he expanded each one. So calcium wasn't exactly 65%. Calcium was 65 to 85% and so forth. He expanded, made it a range rather than a value. He also provided considerable variation in base count saturation for near maximum yields. In other words, even he, who also later in 1959 created these ranges instead of exact values, even his data showed that maximum yield can be achieved across a wide range. It's amazing. These reports, as well as those by several others for different crops, cited in part one of these studies, which is the one I went over on Monday morning for the members only. If you want to watch that, please. Well, if you're a member, you can go watch it. If you're not, you'll need to be a member. You can go back and watch the episode where I talked about this paper from 1981. They cast doubt on the validity of the concept of an ideal base count saturation ratio where maximum yields are likely to occur. And that's the scientific way of saying it's BS. You can't say that in science. You just say, oh, we cast doubt on it, or there wasn't any evidence to support the hypothesis. You know, we have to say it in a structurally sound scientific manner. But what they're saying here is that all the work we did before shows that it doesn't work. It's nonsense. I'll interpret that in a pragmatic way. But since the base count saturation concept is so widely used by soil testing laboratories, and since none of these studies referred to above were systematic studies of calcium, magnesium, and potassium, this study that we're going to talk about today was undertaken. The primary objective was to determine whether an ideal base count saturation or range in ratios exists in a soil when yields reach maximum or near maximum levels, and if so, to identify it. Additional objectives were to examine the SLAN concept by determining the effects of 3 levels of calcium, 3 levels of magnesium, and 2 levels of potassium in all combinations on yield and the composition of important field crops grown in sequence. Now, they're not going to be able to do that very well. They were also wanting to measure the SLAN, or to evaluate the SLAN method, but because the study was set up to specifically look at base count saturation, they'll explain it, but they weren't able actually to really definitively look at SLAN as they would like to, because it was formatted around base count saturation. Anyway, we'll go into that. And 2, to compare the relative merits of the base count saturation and SLAN concepts as criteria for making fertilizer and lime recommendations to maximize yields. Okay. Materials and methods. The plots for these studies were established on a Lownville soil on a farm immediately northwest of Wooster in Wayne County, Ohio. And we have a lot of people, a lot of members of the channel live in Ohio. And so this is right in your neck of the woods. The low pH in calcium and magnesium levels resulted from extended use of sulfur as a fungicide in small fruit and berry culture. The low base status of this soil made it well suited to a cation ratio study, because all adjustments in basic cation saturation ratios could be attained by simple addition of oxides and hydroxides of base cations. In other words, the soil was sort of depleted, low pH, and it's ideal because we can add these base cations in certain ratios. In other words, they were deficient, or they had the ratios were all off, and we can add them back at a known quantity such that the ratios can be anticipated or predicted. Total CEC, now, let me explain this. The CEC gets a little screwy here, but just have don't worry for the base cation saturation con artists and fraudsters. Don't worry. Even because the CEC was slightly off when they measured it later, it was still above your nonsensical fairy number of 10 CEC or 9 CEC or 8 CEC or 7 CEC or whatever number you want to just pull out of thin air. It was still above that even at the end. But let me read what happened, just so we're all on the same page. The total CEC obtained by adding base cations and acidity is higher for this initial very acidic soil. It was 14 CEC in the beginning. Then the approximate 10 CEC obtained later for samples from the treated plots. So in other words, at the beginning it was 14, later it was 10. And what they say is this evidently resulted from the fixation of magnesium, perhaps to a lesser extent than calcium in non-exchangeable forms. So in other words, they're measuring it by summation of cations. For those of you who might not be familiar, basically there's several ways to measure CEC. The way they did it is they just summed up all the cations, and they said, okay, all the cations were X, and we know the charge and all this stuff on the cations, and so we can measure the CEC that way. Well, if you do that, and then some of the treatments actually precipitate out some of the calcium, or they move it into a non-soluble form, basically, then it might lower the CEC later in the study, and that's what happened. But even when they did that, it was still above their 7 and 8. It was 10. Okay. And so here's the chemical, physical and mineralogical properties of the soil. The pH was 4.1 and the CEC was 14.2. And these authors include the mineralogical work, which is surprising. I mean, it's good they do that. They may have been mineralogists. I don't know, because you don't usually see this in literature, illite and chloratized vermiculite and kaolinite. But that gives soil scientists an idea of the type of soil and the type of reactivity that soil might have based upon the types of clay that exist and the quantities of the clays that exist. Anyway, it's interesting to me, probably boring to everybody else. Field plot layout, treatments applied, and crop studies. Okay, so treatment variables were this: calcium, and they did it at pH 5, 6, and 6.5. They adjusted it with calcitic lime. So in other words, they applied calcium as a treatment, and they did it to where it was adjusted up to 5, 6, and 6.5 pH. That's the way they applied the calcium. And then they applied magnesium such that it was a 4, 6, or 10% of the CEC, and they applied potassium such that it was 2.4 or 4.3% of the CEC. So it would change the ratios or the base cation saturation accordingly to that percentage. Each of the calcium, magnesium, potassium variables occurred in a complete factorial design. A factorial design just means it has all combinations of all treatments. That's all that means. The magnesium and potassium were supplied as magnesium oxide and potassium chloride. And, okay, the next thing. Oh, Eric Lickness says that mineralogy is good. One of the funnest classes, I should say, by one of the best professors I ever had was soil mineralogy. It was one of the funnest classes in University of Florida. That professor was awesome. I think his book's still sitting behind me somewhere. I love that class. It wasn't my thing, but I liked the class. I liked the way that he taught it. It was really good. The experiment was established in April of 1975. Sufficient amounts of calcium, magnesium, potassium materials for the above levels were added as uniformly as possible to each plot by hand. The soil was then disced approximately 10 centimeters deep, which would be, I guess, 4 inches, I guess. Yeah, 4 inches or so. In both directions with a double disc, and the first crop of corn planted immediately. The soil was plowed 4 additional times in the early spring in 76 and 77 and the fall of 77 and 78. Additional supplemental basic cation treatments were added to the surface of the soil without further cultivation in order to maintain as near as possible the initial levels of calcium, magnesium, potassium. Okay, so In other words, they applied the treatments and then they planted the crop, and then later on they would disc it up and they would harvest it, and then they would apply more treatments such that they would try to maintain what the treatments were at the beginning. The crop cultivars were soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa, and you can see some people are interested in this. I don't know anything about it, but the other day someone was asking me what kind of corn did they use. I don't even know really what that means. I'm not a corn person, but here's the types of varieties of these crops that they used. Oh, they used corn here too in 1976. I didn't highlight that one, sorry. So corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa. After relatively complete mixing of the treatments throughout the top 20 centimeters, or I guess that's 8 inches, of soil was accomplished by the second plowing. Okay, they took soil samples and the soils were analyzed by the Research and Extension Analytical Laboratory at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center in Wooster, Ohio. So that's basically the setup. Okay, they're applying different quantities of calcium, potassium, and magnesium, and they're applying, and they did it in a factorial design. Basically what that gives us is you can hold one of them constant and you can look at all the combinations of the other two together. And then you can hold the other one constant and look at the combination of the other two and so forth. So you can see what is like, what happened with yield or whatever they're going to be measuring based upon holding one constant or even holding two constant and measuring and varying the other one. Okay. Results and discussion. Basic cation saturation for near maximum yield of crops. The obvious crop responses to increased pH. The obvious crop responses to increased pH, but only from 5 to 6, except for magnesium level. Oh, that's weird the way they worded that. Except for high magnesium level on corn in 1976. I'll show these in the table. And the less evident adverse effect of high levels of potassium on corn both years and its favorable effect on alfalfa. So again, you're going to see potassium on a table in here. Again, show that the addition of potassium resulted in a reduction in growth. Again, how many papers? You can go back and look at the potassium playlist. And I think I had a score sheet or a scoreboard on the potassium episodes. And I kept a running tally. How many publications showed a positive response, a negative response, or no response? And there were just as many that showed a negative response that showed a positive response. And here in agriculture, you'll see there's a negative response, a reduction in yield as a result of applying potassium. Not on all of them, okay, but there was a negative response measured. Careful examination of the yield data versus the calcium, magnesium, and magnesium potassium ratios of the soil indicates low degree of association between them. So that means what it says. There wasn't a very strong association between any of the ratios and yield. I mean, it says it right there in the second paragraph of the results. But I like the way they go into this. They kind of, I don't know. I should do more of this when I'm writing. They kind of develop a argument, I suppose, or it's more like a debate language. I don't know how I'll read it and you'll see what I'm talking about. But I think I'm probably going to start writing more like this. If the suggestions of Baer in 1945 that the ideal soil should have a calcium magnesium ratio of 6.5 is valid, crop yields should increase from calcium magnesium ratios up to 6.5, then decrease after 6.5. Similarly, if the ideal soil has a magnesium potassium ratio of 2, yields should increase with magnesium potassium ratios up to 2 and then drop. So what they're saying is if Baer's, magical percentage of 65% calcium, which is a 6.5 calcium magnesium ratio, if that is accurate, then you should see the growth slowly increase and max out at 6.5 calcium magnesium. You should see that. And then you should see it drop after 6.5. And the same thing with potassium. You should see it increase up to 2 potassium or magnesium potassium and then drop after 2. That's what you should see if Baer's correct. Okay, let's see what happens. We didn't. In general, all of the R-squared values for individual crops were very low and somewhat variable. In only 2 or 3 cases of the 12 examined was R negative at calcium magnesium ratios greater than 6.5. So in other words, was the was the slope going down after it increased past 6.5. So was the yield going down? Only in 2 or 3 cases of the 12 did it even show that. Okay. For magnesium potassium greater than, and none were negative for magnesium potassium ratio. So and none of the magnesium potassium slopes of the regressions were ever negative. And only about 20-25% of the slopes were negative when the calcium magnesium ratio exceeded 6.5. So in other words, the yield was declining. Only about 20-25% of the time. So 75% of the time it wasn't declining when it got above 6.5. Okay. Except where high potassium, low magnesium potassium ratio, depressed corn yields, I'm going to show you that, or increased alfalfa yields, and thus resulted in somewhat higher R-squared values, the base count saturation values accounted for 16% or less of the variations in yields of the individual crops. So what they're saying is, when you account for, I guess they were doing R-squared, yeah, they're doing a bunch of R-squareds, the base count saturation only accounted for about 16% of the air. Basically, 16% is all they're able to account for. 84%, there's something going on that the base count saturation cannot account for that, or can't explain. These average R-square values, I mean, here's the, I'll show this to people watching. Here's what they're talking about. So when calcium magnesium was less than 6.5, all crops and treatments, these are the R-squared, is 0.165. So to give you an idea, when we're running samples in a lab and we're running a standard curve, we won't even start analyzing samples until we have 3 nines, 999 R-squared, meaning that we are 99.9%. We're accounting for 99.9% of the variation on that standard curve. And then we can put the unknown in, and we can accurately predict, or to 99.9% predict what the actual value is in the unknown. That's in the labs. In field work, anything north of 60%, you probably want to start looking at, like, okay, there's probably a relationship here somewhere. If you get anywhere near 70-80%, then there's very likely something going on in the field with whatever variables you're looking at. Okay. In greenhouse work and laboratory work, that R-squared is probably going to be a little bit higher. You're probably going to start around 80% or so, 75-80%. In other words, in the field, there's a lot of variables, okay? But if you can get, 60% or so, something around that number, and then or even higher, then you can have some confidence in that what we're saying is there's probably something going on. And the highest they got was 16. So in other words, you can't really explain it in 16% when the calcium magnesium was less than 6.5. Okay. When the magnesium potassium was less than 6.5, when they removed the treatments from pH 5, I'll explain why they did that in a minute. They removed it because the crop didn't grow. Basically, at pH 5, the crop didn't grow, and they said, well, that's not really representative of reality. The crop's dead, so they removed it. And when they removed it, the magnesium potassium ratios were 25%. So still 75% you can't account for. That's really horrible. Is what that means. Okay. So these average R-square values for all crops and treatments clearly indicate very low degrees of association between crop yields and base count saturation for these levels of calcium magnesium and magnesium potassium ratios. Excuse me. So once again, however you want to slice the cake, base count saturation is not winning. Okay? I'm speaking directly to the fraudsters and con artists who are fleecing the turfgrass industry by convincing people to apply nutrients because of base count saturation. And what gets me is, I don't know if it's arrogance or if it's ignorance or what it is, but if you're a con artist, which if you're selling base count, you're selling nutrients based on base count saturation, you are a con artist. If you are that, and I'm showing paper after paper after paper showing that it's false, that it's not true. If your argument is, well, we've been doing it for 30, 40 years and it's been working, I don't think I'd be telling people that. What you're saying is you've been conning people and fleecing our industry for 30 or 40 years. I wouldn't be proud of that. Well, thanks, Jane Pink. Cake, he says. Thanks a lot. I appreciate the donation. $10. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. But that's I've heard them make that argument. We've been doing it for 30 or 40 years and it works. I definitely would not say that because it's a con. There's no evidence to support it. And there's ample evidence to refute it. So even if there were no evidence to refute it, saying you've been doing it for 30 or 40 years is in no way a reason for someone else to follow it. Right? That's the appeal to tradition fallacy. You've been doing it for so long, and therefore it must work. So other people must be convinced to do it because we've been doing it for so long. That's a fallacy. It's called appeal to tradition. But in this case, we know it doesn't work. So I wouldn't be saying that. I wouldn't be saying, well, we've been doing it for 30, 40 years. Anyway, I digress. Since the only consistent main treatment effect on all crops in this study was pH, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. And by the way, remember, William Albrecht, who really perpetuated this whole nonsense in his book, which I'm happy to show you. I'd show you, but I don't have his book on my bookshelf. He says soil pH doesn't really affect plants that much. And in this paper, you're going to see exactly why he was delusional, completely delusional. The only consistent main treatment effect was pH. Lower yields at pH 5, at lower pH 5, we'll discuss it later, it seemed reasonable that if calcium, magnesium, and magnesium potassium ratios per se were indeed associated with yield, that fact might be best demonstrated if the data for all pH 5 treatments were omitted. So they omitted it because some of the treatments on pH 5 they just killed, or some of the plants that just killed it. Omission of these data from the computations changed the average range between highest and lowest yielding treatments for the 6 crops from 41 to 28%, and left unchanged significant differences between highest and lowest yields of the crop. So what they're saying is they removed some of the pH 5 stuff, but it didn't affect the data. I mean, it didn't really affect any of the differences that would have existed or did exist. They removed it because they thought it was more representative of what might actually happen in reality. But it left unchanged the significant differences between highest and lowest yields of each crop. So the highest and lowest yield of each crop were the same. Okay. Let's see. I don't know if I'm going to read this whole thing. I think what I'm going to do is just show this table and then skip through the bottom. So here's table 3, the ranges in soil basic cation saturation ratios for the 5 highest and 5 lowest yield levels and the percentage overlap of 2 for the 6 crops and 12 treatments. pH 5 treatments were omitted. So what you'll see here is calcium magnesium ratios over here on the left, and you see the yield level. These are the highest 5 yield levels, and this is the lowest yield levels of the 5. And then you'll see when the magnesium potassium ratios, you'll see the highest yield and the lowest yield, right? Well, over here on the right, you're going to see Bayer's ideal ratio. Remember, the calcium magnesium should be 6.5 according to Bayer, and it should be 5 to 14 according to Graham. So if it's 6.5, that's what he's saying is ideal. That by definition is where the highest yield would be attained. Well, let's look at and what you're seeing here are all the actual ranges of the highest 5 yielding treatments or highest 5 yielding plots. And we see the ratio of the calcium magnesium ranged from 5.7 to 26.8 in corn in 1975. The lowest was 5.8 to 21. So in other words, the highest yields and the lowest yields had essentially the same ratios on corn in 1975. And some of the highest yields were lower than the 6.5. This 5.7 here and the highest yield, that's lower than what Bayer was saying you should have. Remember, when you go above 6.5, it should go down. And we had calcium magnesium ratios up in the 26s, and they were still some of the highest yields of this corn. You can go down corn 76, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, see all this stuff. And you see the ranges of calcium magnesium vary from below Bayer's range to 3 times higher, 4 times higher than Bayer's range. And the highest yields, they were all the highest yields, guys and gals. When you look at the lowest yields, oftentimes they're the exact same ranges. Corn 76, the highest was 5.7 to 14.3, and the lowest was 5.0 to 16.1. Okay? You can go through here and look. Pause the video if you want to look at all the details, but essentially it's the same thing, whether it's alfalfa or wheat or soybeans. When you go to magnesium to potassium, you see the ideal ratio should be 2 parts magnesium to 1 part potassium. And you'll see some of the highest yields came from magnesium potassium ratios of 0.6. Look at this, 0.6, 0.6, 0.6. Well below, more than double, more than half less than the 2 proposed by Bayer. And some of these were quite a bit higher, 3.1, 3.13. And remember, they should be lower as you exceed 2.0 according to Bayer. All right, and then the lowest were very similar. In other words, the ranges for the highest and the lowest overlapped. Okay, it didn't matter the crop. So what this is saying is the ratios don't really matter. You can have the highest or the lowest yield, and the base cation ratios can be whatever they might be. And they might result in the highest yields. They might result in the lowest yields. You might be above Bayer's range. You might be below Bayer's range. It doesn't, you might have the highest or low. It's all over the place. Okay. That's what this is saying. This table is saying. Okay. I wanted to show, I thought it was on another table. It must be down here. Yeah, it's down here. Okay. I'm getting to it. Clearly then, there is no evidence in this study of a single calcium to magnesium or magnesium to potassium ratio or range of either, which is associated only with high yields of crops. This is the last sentence in this particular section of the results. There's no evidence to support it. I still want to know what the corn otters say. I mean, I have seen a couple of videos of the fraudsters talking about it. And one of them said, well, when I showed up, he was included in actually some of the acknowledgments of one of the papers. And he was saying, well, when I showed up, they already had the plots laid out. They weren't even listening. They were just doing whatever. Okay. I disagree with that. I mean, I agree with him that you should include other people. You should include the opposite side, and you should include them in the process. Okay. I don't know why he showed up late. I don't know even if he was late. But the reason is because they will use every excuse in the book to find some reason why your study, was invalid. Okay. Okay. Let's assume that was invalid. There's another 40 studies. Are all of them invalid? I wonder how they approach this when they're presented with this information. Like, yeah, the calcium magnesium ratios don't matter. Yeah. Here's paper after paper. I've just shown my channel. Paper after paper after paper of, these authors showing that the calcium magnesium ratio doesn't matter. Base concentration doesn't matter. Not within, reason. I mean, only in extreme cases where you have just complete deficiencies of one element. And in that case, it would just be a deficiency or a toxicity. It wouldn't be the ratio probably. I wonder how they approach that. How do they feel comfortable talking to their customers about this stuff when they know it's nonsense? I mean, they might be actually convinced that it is true, but when they're presented with, irrefutable evidence, do they just stick their head in the sand? I mean, I couldn't sleep at night. I don't know how they do it. I guess they do it on a mattress full of cash, I guess. I don't know how they do it, but maybe they're sleeping better than I am. Responses of crops to base cation saturation or base cations applied the SLAN concept. Since the intent of this study was to provide a wide range of base cation saturation values at each of the 3 pH levels and to examine the crop response to them, rather than to examine response to base cation saturations through their entire ranges from insufficiencies to sufficiencies, it was not the best designed study for the evaluation of the SLAN concept. So what they're saying is, we weren't adjusting things only to sufficiency levels or above it. That wasn't really how it was designed. They were trying to evaluate the SLAN during the same study, but you can only, in this particular way they set it up, you could only really look deep at the base count saturation. So they didn't really look deep into the SLAN stuff that much. Okay. So crop yields. As mentioned previously, the only consistent main treatment effect on crop yields in increasing pH was 5 to 6, but not above 6. So let me show this real quick, this table. So this table has the effect of pH, the effect of magnesium, and the effect of potassium as main effects. Okay. And you'll see I've highlighted in green the treatments that resulted in an effect, in a change. And you'll see every crop, corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, whatever, every one of them changed when the pH was increased to 5 to 6. So this is one reason why I'm saying if William Albeck truly believed that pH did not affect plant growth, he was delusional. That's just the way it is. No other way to say it. He was just simply delusional, because it affects time after time after time. pH will affect plant growth. And here's example after example of that exact assertion. And then you'll see in this particular year with soybeans, the increase in magnesium actually resulted in an increase in yield for this one specific crop. And then the other crops it had nothing to do with, it didn't do anything. And then alfalfa, potassium increased alfalfa yield slightly in 1 year. But look what happened over here with corn in 75 and corn in 76. There was a reduction in yield when they increased the potassium from 2.4 to 4.3% on the base kind saturation rates. So you saw a reduction again from the application of potassium. And I'm not here saying you should never apply potassium, okay? What I'm saying is you should apply potassium only when there's a good reason, whenever you see a deficiency or whenever your turf has looked a little off or whatever, and you confirm that with a soil test that indicates you're low. I would say we do have enough. I mean, I'm fairly confident with the potassium levels on Mehlich 3 tests. I can't really speak for potassium on some other tests, but if you're using Mehlich 3 tests, I'm confident enough with the potassium numbers on Mehlich 3 to give you an idea of what your risk is. So, I mean, if you're 40 or 50, you're on the line, basically. If you're below it, it doesn't mean that you're going to have bad turf, but certainly if you're down in, the teens or the 10, 20 range, then you're at a pretty high risk of potassium deficiency. So the reason I'm saying that is I could make a case to recommend the application of potassium without looking at the turf grass, possibly. I wouldn't be real comfortable with that, but it's possible. You could at least express to the client or to the manager, hey, I would keep an eye on this because you're getting down to the point where it's very likely that you're going to experience potassium deficiency at some point. Okay, so I guess, that's my take on potassium and soil testing. If you're above 50, 60, it's really parts per million, Mehlich 3, it's really hard for me to be convinced that you're going to see a positive response to applying potassium. I just haven't ever seen that in the literature. Around the 50 mark is where the line is. I'm sure someone can pull it up, but I've just never really seen any beneficial response to applying potassium in the literature when you get above 50. There might be one or two odd papers, but I just don't have really any good reason to, unless I'm looking at the turf and I can see that there's a potassium deficiency, I can diagnose that, and your potassium is like right at 50, then that'd be a good reason to apply it. But once you're at 50, 60, I just don't see any point. And in fact, you can see here on this yield here that the yield went down from applying potassium in this case. And we showed paper after paper where the disease went up from applying potassium on turf grasses, both warm season and cool season grasses. You greatly increase the chance of disease incidence, not reducing disease, increasing disease. This whole idea that potassium is going to reduce your stress and reduce your disease incident or whatever is only the case when your potassium is well deficient. Once it's sufficient, applying more potassium is only going to increase your disease risk. So I'd be careful with that. I wonder how many people listening are willing to kind of tell me what their thoughts are on potassium. Since most people here tonight are here regularly. I wonder if you all have changed your management practices on potassium or not, because that would be very gratifying to me to know that this channel is making an impact or making a difference on your management practices, because you watched it and I showed papers that you probably don't need to apply it at all, and then you changed your behavior. To get a human to change their behavior in my world is very, very difficult. It's and even in general, it's very difficult, and it's even more difficult to actually measure that. And that's what a lot of extension faculty have to do. They're faced with that task of measuring impact, measuring change in behavior, and so part of me is still interested in knowing if I'm having a positive impact. Sorry, I'm long-winded tonight. Sorry, guys. So back on the pH 5 and 6, you saw a reduction, or you saw a change from 5 to 6. Parenthetically, it will be noted that the average of all pH values measured here were 5.7 to not 6.0. But the fact that soil samplings were taken after cropping, which had been preceded by initial and subsequent applications of base cations to adjust the soil treatment levels, means that the average soil test levels were slightly on the low side of the levels experienced by the crops. The effect of the higher level of potassium on corn crops in the first alfalfa crop, also noted earlier, were rather straightforward. The adverse effect of the higher K level on the corn yields was a consequence of, I don't, and by the way, I don't know if this is true. I wish they would have softened the language a little bit. But the reason why we see adverse effects to, occasionally we'll see adverse effects to potassium applications is not fully understood. So I'm saying that before I say this next sentence, because I'm not sure that this is actually true or not. The adverse effects of the higher potassium levels on the corn yields was a consequence of heavy rates of potassium applied to establish the potassium levels in a 0 to 20 centimeter depth, so heavy amounts of potassium. And 2, they're being worked initially into the soil surface. And 3, less than adequate moisture later, especially in 1976. So they're just saying a really high rate was applied, it was mixed in, and they didn't have enough moisture. That very well could be the case. I'm just saying, I don't know. They're postulating what could have occurred, and that's fine. That's what they're supposed to do, but I just wish it would have been softer, because someone can read that and go, okay, that's definitely what happened, because they said that's what happened, but they don't actually know why that happened. They just know that they measured a reduction. On the other hand, the favorable effect of a high level of potassium on alfalfa was a consequence of very high potassium removal by the crop without adequate replenishment, in which case the higher K level was beneficial. So they're saying the alfalfa, you're removing a large quantity of material, it was depleting it, and they're applying more potassium, and it resulted in an increase. It's a nice postulate. I'm just saying, I don't know if you'd get that through reviewers today. You'd have to provide a little bit more background or convincing language to get that into an article today, I think. Because they don't really know. They're just postulating, and just need to make sure that the audience understands rather than takes that as fact. The very low pH and the consequent release and buildup of soluble aluminum and also potentially manganese and iron prior to starting these studies may have affected the pH where maximum yields were obtained with lime. So they're saying that they're just trying to get into explain why they had the low pHs resulted in a reduction in yield. It's possible that because the calcium was applied as lime, that it might have alleviated an aluminum toxicity. And that kind of, I don't know if that's a little jab at Dr. Albrecht or not, but remember his concept was pH didn't have an effect because it's really calcium saturation. And what I've said for weeks and weeks here, a month, whatever it's been, is that really he was probably alleviating an aluminum toxicity because he was adjusting the pH up, and he wasn't accounting for the pH adjustment. He was just looking at the calcium saturation. And so I don't know if they're kind of jabbing at him here or not, because that's what was happening. And he was saying, and they're saying here, well, it's, the soluble aluminum prior to starting at that very low pH, it might have been adjusted because the calcium was applied as lime. And that's probably why you saw a yield increase when they applied it. The lack of yield response by any crop to increase magnesium level was also unexpected. So that wouldn't be unexpected to me, but I don't deal with crops. I don't deal with corn and soybeans and alfalfa. I would be more surprised that there was a magnesium response than there wasn't in turfgrass. Also in the present soil, due to the very low levels of level initially present, almost 0.5 centimoles of magnesium was added to establish and maintain even the lowest 4% magnesium level. Evidently, this was sufficient to meet the magnesium requirements of the crop grown on this soil. So in other words, they're saying we didn't expect them to be no response, but apparently the very low level of magnesium was probably enough. And that's the reason I've said for, I don't know how many weeks on magnesium, you're probably not going to see a response to magnesium because you probably got enough in your soil already. It doesn't really get bound up. It really doesn't oxidize out very easily at all. It's soluble in the soil. Whatever you apply is going to hang around the soil until you wash it out, probably. So you probably have enough. Adding more is probably not going to help you. It's only, again, I'm talking to the whole world here. I'm sure there's cases where there's magnesium deficiencies. I'm not saying that's not true. That's probably true. But these ideas that I'm going to put in 2% iron, 2% manganese, 2% magnesium, and a 15-5-15 and put it out, it's probably wasting a lot of money. I mean, I did my work on magnesium in Florida, where it's high sand soils, deep sandy soils with very low retention, and we still didn't see any magnesium responses. It's very, very unusual to see a magnesium response. All right, we're getting to the end. Last two paragraphs. Crop compositions. I didn't go over this. If you want to see the crop composition, it's up here in this table. I'm not going to go over all this. This is just like the percentage of calcium, magnesium in the crop. They're going to summarize it in this paragraph. The average main treatment effect on base calories and corresponding crop composition, calcium, magnesium, potassium, are given in Table 5. Except for the wheat, where the grain only was analyzed, all crops showed significant increases in the composition of calcium, magnesium, potassium with increased calcium, magnesium, potassium. Generally, the magnesium composition increased relatively more with level of magnesium than did calcium and potassium. The decreased calcium content of the soil with increased magnesium level was also reflected as decreased calcium in the tissue of 4 of the 6 crops. Also, the higher potassium level depressed the magnesium composition slightly, but significantly in all other crops except for the wheat grain. It's evident from these data that crops generally take up more basic cations as their levels are increased in the soil. So in other words, you keep applying it, you see the values kind of go up. Okay. However, the increased levels in the soil of one cation may depress the availability of the crop of the other. And I've been saying this. The Miller paper showed this. I went over Dr. Miller's paper. There's been other papers in Turfgrass that have shown this. So we're talking about agriculture tonight, corn and soybeans. But in this case, it's not really that different. If you're going to apply something, you better do it for a good reason. Let me explain why. Let's assume that you're not deficient in potassium. You're not deficient, okay? You're fine. And you go out and you think, well, I'm going to apply magnesium because magnesium is a center ion in the chlorophyll molecule and it must result in greening. So you're going to go out there and throw out a bunch of magnesium. Well, let's say your potassium was right at that 40 to 50 parts per million mark that I mentioned earlier. Let's say it was right on that line. And you go out there and throw out a bunch of magnesium. Well, the magnesium is going to compete with the potassium in the soil for cation exchange sites. And you're going to, but through mass action of magnesium, you're going to knock off some of the potassium and potentially move the potassium through the root zone. And if that happens and you're on the critical line, then you might end up resulting in a potassium deficiency where none existed before and no magnesium deficiency existed before. So I'm just saying, don't just go out and blindly start throwing all this stuff out, because the soil can only hold so much. Okay, and it's out there right now. Whatever's out there right now is what it can hold. And if you're going to throw something else in, it's going to start competing with other cations in the solution and in the exchange sites as well. So I just wouldn't encourage anybody to do that unless you know, or you're convinced, through good reasons, that you indeed are deficient in this particular nutrient, or you've had a pre-existing condition of low nutrient levels that have resulted in poor turf. Then you can go and apply that element. That makes sense. But it just doesn't make sense to me to go out and throw out a bunch of nutrients, particularly cations, like calcium, magnesium, potassium, unless you have a good reason, because you could throw off this whole thing off. Okay, we conclude from these results, all aspects of this study we conclude from the results of all aspects of this study that in fertilizer and lime practices, emphasis should be placed on providing sufficient but not excessive levels of each basic cation rather than attempting to adjust a favorable basic cation saturation ratio which evidently does not exist, as others have reported. And he cites like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other papers. We went over the Olsen 82 paper. And he even includes, and again, I think this is like a little jab, he even includes the Hunter and Bear paper, 1943. He includes a paper from one of the authors that created it as a means to refute the claim. I think that's hilarious. But I'm neurodiverse, so maybe I'm the only one that thinks this is funny. So whatever. Anyway, so here's another paper, and I keep telling myself I'm going to get a scoreboard for base cation saturation. I just haven't done it yet. But it's all going to be on the negative column. There's not one that shows that it works. So it's all going to be doesn't work, doesn't work, doesn't work, doesn't work, doesn't work. There won't be one on the positive column. And if someone knows of one that shows a positive response, then send it to me and I'll be happy to go over it. But I'm not aware of any paper that shows it. I'm aware of papers that claim it, that make a claim, but none actually show any evidence to support the claim. Okay. Let me go to the chat. Oh, Chuck says he has an open bag of 32-pound bag of potassium sulfate for anybody. Well, don't forget though that I'm giving a talk in J, and I have two photographs on there, and one of the slides is potassium sources can trick you. So if you have a sulfate deficiency, Chuck, then you'd have a good reason to apply a form of sulfate, and obviously potassium sulfate is a form of sulfate. So there may be a good reason to apply sulfate in that form if you have a sulfate deficiency. And then Gray, oh, there we go. Gray says he uses ammonium sulfate. So he's getting his sulfate from ammonium sulfate. Joseph Collis says, the Facebook group I'm in for New England lawns has about 1,200 members and does a weekly guide. Potassium recommendations have totally changed based on based on my videos? Really? I keep hearing this thing about Facebook. And by the way, I need help. Jay Pink was on here earlier. Jay Pink, please email me. This is how incompetent I am. I went on to start I keep hearing Facebook has all these stuff going on. I'm not on Facebook. I have an account, but I never log in. So I went to create a Facebook account for Turfgrass Epistemology. If I'm lying, I'm dying. I set it up and I hit join or submit or whatever the button was. And I came back like an hour later and it says, you've been banned. Like, what? It's like your account has been suspended. And I was like, what? All I did was like try to start an account and I got suspended. I didn't even do anything. So then it said, I was like, well, maybe it's just a fluke. So I waited till the next day and I logged in again to see if it had like somehow gone through. And it said, your account has been suspended. You have, something about an appeal. You can no longer appeal this decision. And that's all it said. So I'm stuck. I can't open a Facebook account for Turfgrass Epistemology because the reason I'm saying that is because I keep hearing about this Facebook group and I'd like to provide a little bit more content for Facebook, but I can't do it. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I need help. And I did the same thing with TikTok and TikTok suspended me. And I didn't post anything. All I did was try to open up an account. But this 12,000 members, and I'm interested in what you're saying, Joseph Calla. I don't know if you go by Joe or Joseph. I'm interested in knowing what that is. If the group of 12,000 members has adjusted the recommendations based on what they've heard here, that would be very interesting to know. And furthermore, up in New England, I'll be in Connecticut in March at the what's it called, the Northeast or New England Turf Research Foundation Conference. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Joe Calla. I'm not sure, but I'll be speaking in March at their conference up in Connecticut. So if anybody's interested or in that area, then by all means, swing by and say hello to me. That's many months away, but thanks for saying that, Joe. Eric Lickness says, I will say he has sought out 4600 urea with no potassium in it as a result of this channel. Okay. That and Cornell's recommendation. Yeah, Cornell's got some really good professors. One of the best is over at Cornell. Well, several of the best are at Cornell. Chuck Benzing says, last question, does base count saturation have a leg to stand on regarding soil texture? Okay, yeah, so soil texture, I don't know if I've gotten soil texture. There is one paper that I'm aware of. I think the author is Dantasova, I think. I'll have to look it up. There is one paper that shows there's a grain of sand of evidence regarding base count saturation and soil texture, not texture, but the soil structure. There's a tiny sliver of sand level evidence on that for that one paper, and I'll include that paper. I'm happy to go over that paper. However, there's also a mountain of papers that show that under practical settings, unless the magnesium ratio or percentage is so high, 70, 80% or greater, then it's irrelevant. In other words, the Donasova paper, I don't want to say that. I think it's the Donasova paper. showed that there was an effect, but it was only in settings where magnesium would never really exist in nature, being 70, 80% or something like that. So good question, Chuck. I would say that for 99% of the locations and situations, there's no reason to follow base count saturation for soil structure. Okay. There's really not going to have any effect. It would be a matter of, if there is a soil structure problem, it may matter of diagnosing it and coming up with a treatment plan or a solution, but it would not include, the treatment plan would not include balancing out the cations. Okay. Oh, okay. So Joe Cal says the Facebook group did to change. Okay. All right. Well, very interesting. Very interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. I would like to know more about that, guys and gals. If you know of, I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on all this other stuff. I don't do that. I'm sorry. I'm not that there's anything wrong with it. I'm not wired that way. But I would like to know more about that. If there's people changing their behaviors based upon this channel, if there's anybody in this Facebook group that they're talking about that is active and like influential in terms of their changing whatever they're changing, reach out to me and let me know. I wouldn't mind having a conversation with you. Okay, guys and gals. I'll be back on Monday morning. Tuesday morning, we're having another video. And by the way, I won't mention who, but somebody sent me a video. One of the members, I think, sent me a video of another YouTuber that he came across about soil testing and soil pH and so forth. So I may end up going over that video. It's a shorter video on Tuesday morning, but I really appreciate all the members. Thank you so much for being a member and contributing to this channel and to Turfgrass research. I really appreciate it. It goes a long way with me and for research. Thanks a bunch, guys. Have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday morning.